Social Studies 30-1 source analysis this week will be on the topic of totalitarianism. I'll give you a few seconds to read over the source, then we will get into it. Okay, so the source, you have to think back to Social 20-1 when you learned about the Russian Holodomor, which was the mass murder of kulaks, many of them Ukrainians. They were farmers. The reason for the Holodomor was that the kulaks, many of them Ukrainians, refused to go along with Stalin's policy of forced collectivization. So if you think back to part of Stalin's policies was the taking away of people's private property. And so when it came to the kulaks, the wealthy Ukrainian farmers, a lot of them, most of them refused to hand over their stuff to the communist government. I can't blame them, I wouldn't either. And rather than hand it over to the government, a lot of them actually sabotaged their crops, their livestock, and produce. They burnt their farms to the ground in many cases rather than give it to the communists. In retaliation for this, Stalin basically murdered them. And he did this by not giving them food. Don't forget that Stalin controlled the distribution of food, resources, and so on in the Soviet Union. This was a centralized economy. And so he just didn't feed the kulaks, the Ukrainian farmers. Millions of them starved to death. I had read accounts of maybe as many as 9 million. Could have been a little less, could have been a little more. I guess we'll never know for sure. But this was a man made ethnic cleansing of the kulaks. Because they wouldn't go along with his policies, but also because he's scapegoating part of his population as well. And you'll see this when we learn more about totalitarianism. One of the tools in the toolbox of the totalitarian dictator is to give people the focus for their anger. You don't want your population turning on you as the leader, or you don't want the country dividing itself in a civil war. So you give them a scapegoat. It's usually a minority group, and that's what you let they focus their anger on, that minority group, that scapegoat. In this case, it was the kulaks, the Ukrainians. I like the part two about the dictatorship of the proletariat. If you think back to our look at communism, stage three of the communist dialectic involved the dictatorship of the proletariat. This was when, after the revolutionaries have toppled a fascist government, rather than chaos and anarchy, a few men, maybe one person, takes over and leads the country. That is the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is stage three. And that's what's going on in our source. This is under the orders of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In terms of your links, well, I would link this to obviously the rule of law. What you're going to find is that in any authoritarian regime, especially a totalitarian authoritarian regime, they put themselves above the rule of law. The government acts above the rule of law, and as soon as that happens, people lose rights and freedoms. So a government that is beyond above the rule of law comes at the expense of your basic rights and freedoms. And you can see what it resulted in for the Holodomor. Millions of kulaks starved to death. I had read that at its peak in 1932, every 17 seconds someone was starving to death in the former Soviet Union. And it wasn't a natural famine. This was a man-made famine. It was deliberate. It was intended to be a mass murder, to get rid of the kulaks as a social class. So for sure, we're linking it to rule of law, rights and freedoms. That's probably as far as I would go with it. You might mention there's a lack of economic freedom for the kulaks, maybe a lack of self-interest. And speaking of self-interest, maybe it's an example of government putting itself above or abiding by its own self-interest rather than what is best for its citizens and its population. Really good painting depicting the Holodomor in the former Soviet Union, a mother starving with her infant, um, the helplessness, the hopelessness. In the background, the colors are dark. They're very foreboding, probably bodies on these carts being taken away for burial, burning, or whatever. I just always like the painting. I think the arts, the visuals are really important in social studies and history. So I hope that helps you with the source too. I can't think of much else for the source. If anything, the person that wrote this might be mildly inadvertently advocating for liberalism, because with the liberal government, with the democracy, the government cannot act above the rule of law. People's rights and freedoms aren't stripped and taken away, and you would certainly, you shouldn't get mass murder in a liberalized government.